Radar shows a private island owned by Jeffrey Epstein missed a direct hit from Hurricane Dorian. Little St. James Island, just southeast of St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands, was east of Dorian's direct line through the Caribbean. Now, this comes as a federal judge formally dismissed a criminal sex trafficking case against Epstein in light of his suicide earlier this month. Joining me now is Casey Frank, senior editor for the Miami Herald. Casey, let's talk about this. Walk us through some of the legal requirements that the federal judge faced when he was ending this case.
Well, the judge had to end the case because you cannot prosecute a dead man. But the first thing he wanted to do earlier this week was hear from some of Mr. Epstein's victims, and he did so in his courtroom, and more than a dozen of them spoke, and others submitted written statements. I thought it was very noteworthy that they were given the opportunity, even though the judge didn't have to do this, to speak about their experiences with Mr. Epstein. Meanwhile, those victims are talking to us and other journalists. We're learning a lot more about how this operation worked, and it is making clear that the sex trafficking operation, the alleged sex trafficking operation, involved more than just Jeffrey Epstein, which is why this case, I would expect, will continue with charges down the road.
I want to give credit to, before I go, your team and Julie Brown have done a very, very thorough job in this investigation. And the Herald spoke to some of Epstein's alleged victims about what caused them to be lured into Epstein's inner circle. Let's listen to some of those women.
I was 16.
I was 16. I started going to him when I was like 14 turning 15.
If you think at 14, $200, that's a lot of money at 14 years old.
I went from an abusive situation to being a runaway to living in foster homes to just already being hardened by life on the streets.
The other girls that I personally know of that were coming from trailer parks, that were having gun shootings, drugs.
My mother was on drugs at the time, and she couldn't provide for me, and I was pretty much homeless.
We heard from some of those women there, and was it just money that kind of lured them into this?
Well, no, I don't think it was money. I think that from talking to these women, we've found that many of them had circumstances in their lives that caused them to need certain things, whether it was money, whether it was an introduction, whether it was a recommendation to get into a university, or possibly help with medical bills. Mr. Epstein and his enablers were able to zero in on those problems in these women's lives, and he was able to exploit those. And I think what we're also finding is not only how they were drawn in, but how they were kept into Mr. Epstein's orbit. And truly, according to the women, he controlled many aspects of their lives. He paid for them to go to the beauty parlor. He paid for them to get their teeth fixed. He led them into believing that he could perhaps send them on the way to their dream career, or get them into Harvard, or a school that he had a great deal of influence at. So what we're finding is just how insidious this alleged sex trafficking ring really was, and the more women come forward, the more we're finding out.
The criminal case, we hear obviously what happened to that. What does this mean for the victims, though? What does justice look like for them now?
Well, I think justice may look like, number one, some charges being filed against some of Mr. Epstein's enablers, the people who recruited the young women, who who took care of their needs and also convinced them to recruit other young women. I think justice will also play out in the civil courts going forward. And the civil courts have been very important in the Jeffrey Epstein case because that's where we've really learned details of who was involved and in what ways. And there are a number of cases that are moving forward in the civil courts. One of them, the Miami Herald has sued to gain a release of thousands of pages of documents, some of which have already been released, but more we expect will be coming out very soon. And that is where light is being shed on all these sort of dark corners of the Jeffrey Epstein trafficking case.
And I want to ask you about this little black book that we are hearing about. It's fascinating, but also it sounds horrifying. What are we learning about the people in it?
Well, we're tracking those people as we speak, and some of them say, hey, I have no idea why I was in that book, or I met him at a party and I handed him a business card, which is odd because in the case of the individual who said that to us, Mr. Epstein had 6 or 7 or perhaps more phone numbers, and that must have been a very large business card. In any event, many of the people in that black book are from overseas, and we're getting help from other journalistic outfits that we partner with to try to track some of those people, talk to them, find out what their relationships with Mr. Epstein were, and that could also shed some light on the origins of Mr. Epstein's money, because that's still quite a mystery, even though we've learned a little bit over the last few months. We really don't know where the money came from, how rich he was, and who all might have invested through Mr. Epstein.
Casey Frank, the senior editor of the Miami Herald, thank you very much.
Thank you.